Life often hides its most powerful truths in the faces we pass by without a glance. On the cold sidewalks of the city, a man with weary eyes and trembling hands may seem like just another forgotten soul. Yet sometimes, behind the silence, there is a history carved from sacrifice, pain, and courage that the world has chosen to ignore. Tonight's story will take you into a courtroom where a single stolen loaf of bread led to a revelation no one could have imagined. It is a tale of honor buried under years of neglect, of a man reduced to shadows who once carried the weight of others' lives on his shoulders. And when the truth emerges, it will not only shock the room, but also remind us of a timeless lesson. Dignity can be stripped away, but valor never disappears. Stay close because what begins as a case of petty theft will unravel into a moment of recognition that changes everything. Listen carefully, follow every detail, and let this story remind you to look twice at the lives we overlook. And if this moves you, I invite you to follow along, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. Because stories like this one deserve to be remembered. The wind cut sharp that evening in Brooklyn, carrying with it the smell of damp concrete and distant exhaust. Walter Edward Grady stood at the corner of Atlantic Avenue, his thin frame bent under a coat too large for his shoulders. His beard had gone silver, his eyes dulled with hunger, and his body carried the kind of quiet ache that no one noticed anymore. For years he had drifted through the city like a ghost, slipping in and out of doorways, sleeping where the rain could not reach, leaving behind nothing but the faint clink of bottles he collected for a few cents at a time. To the neighbors he was simply the old homeless man, a figure whose presence was tolerated, perhaps pitied, but never truly seen. People passed him daily, their lives busy and their hearts untouched. They never asked what roads had led him here, nor guessed that decades earlier he had worn the uniform of the United States Army. They didn't know about the ribbons folded in a forgotten box, the medals earned in deserts far from home, or the brotherhood forged under fire. None of that mattered anymore, not to a world that looked past him. Walter had once known love that anchored him. Margaret, his wife of 30 years, had been the one constant in a life shaped by deployments, transfers, and silence after battle. She carried the warmth he no longer found in himself. But cancer, misdiagnosed and neglected by the very system he had served, stole her from him. Walter's grief became a tide too strong to resist. He sold their small apartment, gave away nearly everything, and disappeared from the eyes of family and friends. What he didn't give away was the guilt, his private punishment for surviving when Margaret did not. The weeks that followed blurred into seasons, nights spent curled against brick walls, days scavenged through garbage bins behind diners, mornings when the cold bit so hard that his hands stiffened before he could hold a cup of water. He never begged. That stubbornness was born from years of service, from a soldier's pride that would not let him reach out, no matter how desperate. But hunger is its own enemy, relentless and merciless. One late afternoon, Walter's knees buckled as he stood outside Morelli's corner market, the warmth of roasted chickens drifting through the sliding doors. His stomach had been empty too long. His hands trembled, not just from cold, but from the gnawing weakness that threatened to drop him flat on the sidewalk. He stepped inside, blending with the shuffle of shoppers, the bright light stinging his eyes. On the shelf near the bakery section lay a loaf of bread, discounted and wrapped in thin plastic. Day-old, unsold, unwanted. Walter stared at it, his throat tightening. He reached out, his fingers brushing the package as if it were fragile glass, and without thought slipped it into his coat. His lips whispered to himself, almost a prayer, just enough to keep walking one more day. He did not make it far. "Sir," a voice called out, firm and unyielding. Officer Jenkins, broad-shouldered and young, stood near the door with one hand hovering near his belt. The bread slipped from Walter's coat and landed on the tiled floor. Customers turned, some with disgust, others with the detached curiosity reserved for such scenes. Walter straightened as best he could, but his body betrayed him, his back hunched, his hands shaking. "It's a loaf of bread," Walter murmured. I needed—" His words trailed into silence. The officer bent, picked up the package, and studied Walter's face. Beneath the beard and hollow cheeks, he saw something unusual. A chain around Walter's neck, its edges worn, the metal pressed against skin. Dog tags. Jenkins paused. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, wondering if this man before him had once stood where uniforms mattered. But the law was the law, and Walter had been picked up before on minor charges, sleeping where he shouldn't, trespassing, small desperate acts. He cuffed him gently, guiding him past the eyes that burned with judgment. By dawn, Walter sat in a holding cell, the bread long gone, his stomach empty once more. The city had a place for men like him, a docket of names, offenses stacked like stones, each heavier than the last. His arraignment came swiftly, the courtroom bustling with the noise of routine. The judge glanced over files without lifting his head, cases pushed through with mechanical efficiency. When the clerk called Walter Edward Grady, the judge reached for the folder. His eyes scanned the typed lines. Theft, repeat offense, no fixed address. Then came the line that froze him. Service record, United States Army, Staff Sergeant. The name echoed against something deep inside Judge Michael Carmichael. His grip on the folder tightened. He lifted his gaze at last, eyes settling on the frail figure standing before him. Walter raised his head, and for a fleeting second, the judge's memory tore open. Sand, smoke, the roar of gunfire, and a pair of arms dragging him through the dirt. His voice caught. "Recess," he ordered suddenly, his gavel striking wood louder than intended. The courtroom stilled, uncertain. The bailiffs looked at one another. The clerk shuffled papers, confused. Walter lowered his head again, unaware of the storm that had just been stirred. But for Judge Carmichael, that moment was no longer about a loaf of bread or another homeless man shuffled through the system. It was about a name from the past, a shadow from a battlefield he thought he'd left behind. And deep down, he knew that justice in this case was about to take a turn no one in that room could predict. The heavy oak door closed with a thud, muting the buzz of the courtroom beyond. Judge Michael Carmichael leaned against his desk, his breathing uneven. He had presided over thousands of cases, from petty theft to violent crimes, but never had his hands trembled as they did now. He pressed his knuckles to his lips, willing his thoughts to steady. The clerk knocked softly, setting a stack of documents on the table before leaving again. Carmichael's eyes fell on the manila folder at the top, the case file of Walter Edward Grady. He flipped it open with deliberate care, scanning the typed lines once more. Theft, vagrancy, prior arrests. Then the line that mattered. United States Army, Staff Sergeant, retired. The letters swam before his eyes, pulling him back across years and oceans. From the bottom drawer of his desk, Carmichael withdrew a small box he rarely touched. Inside lay a handful of keepsakes, medals, ribbons, and a photograph worn thin at the edges. He held it in the weak light of his desk lamp. In the photo, a squad of men stood in desert fatigues, their smiles faint but genuine, dust streaking their faces. And there, just behind a younger Carmichael, stood Walter, broad-shouldered, his expression serious, eyes shadowed by the weight of responsibility. The judge closed his eyes. The memory surged, sharper than he expected. The searing July heat of Iraq, the endless echo of gunfire, the sand that clung to sweat-soaked skin. He remembered the chaos of an ambush, the explosion that turned night into fire. He had been a medic then, barely 20, stumbling through smoke with ears ringing, unable to hear his own voice calling for help. And then, Walter, arms like iron lifting him, carrying him through the dark, bullets striking dirt at their feet. Carmichael's chest tightened. His own life had been a gift he never repaid. Until this moment, he had never even spoken the man's name aloud outside military circles. But here, in a Brooklyn courtroom, the man who once dragged him to safety now stood accused of stealing a loaf of bread. He pushed the photograph aside and returned to the file. Attached near the back was a brief military record, printed from an old database. 3 combat tours. Bronze Star recipient. Commendations for leadership under fire. One entry caught his eye, a note marked classified, dated July 2003. The wording was vague. Staff Sergeant Walter Grady extracted wounded medic PFC Michael Carmichael from hostile zone, sustaining injuries, under continued enemy fire. The judge's throat constricted. There it was, written in bureaucratic detachment, a sentence that barely hinted at the reality of that night. His survival, His very seat on the bench today rested on the man the world now treated as disposable. He rose quickly, pacing the small chamber. He needed confirmation, something more than faded memory and thin lines on paper. Picking up the phone, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Veterans Affairs," answered a voice. Carmichael gave his name, his title, and requested immediate verification of Walter Grady's service record. The clerk on the other end hesitated before agreeing to expedite the search. Not satisfied, he reached for another number, this one written in careful script in the back of his address book. "Colonel James Mason," the voice answered, gruff and alert despite the late hour. "Colonel, this is Judge Carmichael," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I have a man in my courtroom. Name of Walter Edward Grady. Do you know him?" The line fell silent for a moment. Then came the reply, steady and grave. "I don't just know him. He saved half my unit more than once. Why are you asking?" Carmichael's fingers tightened on the receiver. "Because he's sitting in front of me in chains, arrested for stealing bread." A sharp breath from the colonel. "Impossible. That man is a legend. We still tell recruits about him the day he drove a burning truck away from camp with 17 men trapped inside, knowing it might explode. Or the photo, you remember that one? Him carrying a child out of the rubble. It was in the papers for months. He disappeared after his wife died. But Walter Grady is no thief. He deserves more than this." Carmichael closed his eyes again, letting the words sink in. The image resurfaced, the iconic photograph of Walter with the Afghan child, small arms clinging to his neck as he carried her across a ruined street. That picture had once symbolized American compassion, and yet now the same man had been reduced to stealing food to survive. "I need you in my courtroom tomorrow," Carmichael said firmly. "Bring everything you have. Affidavits, reports, anything that proves who he is. This cannot be handled like another routine case." "I'll be there," Mason promised. "And Judge, don't let them process him like a common criminal. That man carried you out of fire. He carried all of us." The call ended, leaving Carmichael alone with his racing thoughts. He stared at the file, at the stark contrast between the official record and the reality before him. Outside the chamber door, the courtroom stirred. Lawyers shifting papers, bailiffs waiting. Time pressed forward, demanding decisions. When the judge returned to the bench, the room hushed. Walter sat hunched at the defense table, his hands folded, eyes cast downward. To most in the gallery, he was just another homeless man awaiting judgment. But to Carmichael, he was something far greater. The judge adjusted his robe, voice firm though his heart thundered. "This matter is postponed until further review," he declared. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "The defendant will receive a full medical evaluation and temporary shelter under court supervision. Court is adjourned until further notice." The gavel struck. Reporters scribbled notes. Spectators exchanged puzzled glances. No one understood why a simple case of theft was being treated with such gravity. But Carmichael knew. As the bailiffs escorted Walter out, the judge's eyes lingered on him. Recognition pulsed through every heartbeat. The man before him had once been the difference between life and death. And though Walter did not yet realize it, that truth was about to reshape everything. The trial, the city's perception, and perhaps even the nation's conscience. For now, the court recessed, the city unaware that a storm of revelation had just begun to rise. The city never cared much for nuance. By the time dusk fell, the story had already slipped into the hands of online columnists eager to fill their pages with outrage. "Homeless man claims to be decorated soldier," one headline sneered. Another shouted, "Bread thief spins military tale. Community divided." Within hours, social feeds pulsed with venom. Commenters scoffed at the notion that a true veteran could end up in rags. "If he's a war hero, where's his pension?" one wrote. "Stolen valor," another spat, their words sharp as knives. Walter had no idea of the noise outside the cell. He sat on the narrow bench, his back pressed to the cold cinder block wall, a thin wool blanket drawn around his shoulders. His stomach ached from emptiness, but the hunger was not what gnawed at him most. It was the echo of voices, real and imagined, accusing him of things he could never defend. He held the dog tags in his palm, running his thumb over the etched numbers as if they alone kept him tethered to reality. In the other hand, he held a creased photograph of Margaret. Her smile, captured years before illness hollowed her face, warmed him even now. The cell was shared with two other men, both younger, both restless. One of them, tall and wiry with tattooed arms, studied Walter with narrowed eyes. His name was Ray, barely 23, serving time for assault. His brother had been a soldier too, killed in Afghanistan by an IED. The wound was still raw, and anger made him cruel. "You wear those tags like you earned them," Ray muttered, voice low but sharp. "But I see through you. Old men on the street don't end up there if they're real soldiers. Stolen valor's the worst kind of trash." Walter didn't answer. Silence had become his shield. He pressed Margaret's photo to his chest, his eyes fixed on the floor. Ray stood, looming, his voice rising. "My brother didn't come home. And you, what? You get caught stealing bread and act like you served? Disgusting." He shoved Walter's shoulder. The older man staggered but kept upright, bracing against the wall. His eyes didn't flare. His hands didn't raise. He absorbed the insult the way he had absorbed years of winter wind, allowing it to pass through him without striking back. The guard glanced up briefly but said nothing. To them, this was just another night, another clash of tempers behind bars. Walter lowered his gaze again, whispering under his breath words only he could hear. A fragment of prayer, a line from the field, or perhaps simply Margaret's name. Long after Ray slumped back onto his cot, Walter sat awake. Memories stirred, unwelcome yet relentless. He saw flashes of fire in the desert, men shouting over radio static, the weight of bodies heavier than his own across his shoulders. He remembered pulling one soldier after another from wreckage, feeling their blood soak into his uniform as he promised them they would make it home. Some had not. He had kept the promises he could, and yet here he was, labeled a thief, a liar, a fraud. Outside the walls of the jail, the city continued in its rhythm of indifference. Commuters hurried home with bags of groceries, their children tugging at sleeves, laughter echoing on sidewalks Walter used to call his bed. The thought twisted in him. How easily society dismissed those who had once bled for its safety. Water hoses sprayed down sidewalks to drive men like him away. Teenagers hurled half-eaten food at the homeless for sport. Officers passed by without acknowledgement, their radios more important than broken lives. Walter had survived firefights that should have ended him, but the quiet brutality of neglect had nearly done what bullets could not. Still, he never asked for handouts. He never begged. Pride was both his strength and his undoing. Years of discipline told him to endure, to remain standing no matter what storm came. But every man has a breaking point, and Walter had long since drifted near his. The night stretched on, marked only by the dim flicker of fluorescent light that hummed without mercy. Walter's head dipped once, twice as exhaustion pulled at him. Yet sleep was not rest for him. Dreams carried him back to places he did not wish to revisit. Margaret's face appeared, sometimes radiant, sometimes frail and fading, her hand reaching for him, but slipping away no matter how tightly he grasped. Then came the screams, the roar of engines, the shockwave of explosions. He woke with a jerk, heart pounding, sweat dampening his collar. Across the cell, Ray stirred but said nothing. Perhaps he had recognized the sound of nightmares. Perhaps he had seen enough in his brother's eyes to know the truth. Walter returned to stillness, his breathing ragged, but no explanation left his lips. The hours dragged, each minute a reminder that morning would bring more judgment. He imagined standing again before the judge, the room filled with strangers ready to weigh his life on the scale of one desperate act. Would they see him as nothing more than a thief? Or would someone, anyone, recognize that beneath the worn coat and weary eyes lay a man who had once carried others through fire? He folded the photograph of Margaret carefully, tucking it inside his shirt. The dog tags clinked softly as they settled against his chest. These small tokens were all that remained of a life once full, a life of meaning and love. For a moment, he whispered words he had not spoken aloud in years. "I'm still here, Maggie. I'm still breathing." The city outside yawned and turned in its sleep, oblivious to the man in the cell who had once carried its burdens. The question of dignity, of whether it could ever be restored once stripped away, lingered in the stale air. Walter sat motionless, his silhouette barely more than a shadow on the wall. To the world, he remained invisible. But the truth, though hidden for now, waited just beyond the horizon of dawn. And when that truth came to light, it would change more than just the course of a single man's fate. It would force an entire city, perhaps even a nation, to ask what it meant to honor those who had given everything, yet received nothing in return. The morning arrived sharp and bright, though the light did nothing to soften the chill in the courthouse. By the time the bailiffs unlocked the holding cells, word had already spread that something unusual was happening. Reporters had gathered outside with cameras and microphones, their questions rising like a tide, and as soon as the first attorneys stepped into the building. Inside, clerks shuffled papers quickly, and lawyers whispered in corners, eager to catch hints of what might unfold. Walter was led into the courtroom with wrists cuffed, his steps steady despite the weight of curious eyes on him. The gallery was more crowded than it had been the day before. Spectators packed into wooden benches, journalists leaning forward with notebooks poised, sketch artists setting their pencils in motion. The room carried an air of anticipation, as though everyone sensed this case would not follow routine. At the defense table, a new figure waited. Richard Harlow, a lawyer from the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, had replaced the weary public defender. His presence was striking, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, and with a kind of quiet authority that silenced a room before he even spoke. Walter studied him for a moment, confused but too tired to ask questions. The judge entered, and the gavel struck. Michael Carmichael's eyes lingered briefly on Walter before shifting to the files before him. He looked composed, yet the tension in his jaw betrayed the storm he kept hidden. Case of the People versus Walter Edward Grady, the clerk announced. The prosecutor, a sharp-tongued woman named Evelyn Shore, rose with her file. Her voice carried clearly as she declared, "The charge is theft. The defendant was apprehended in the act of concealing property not his own. Regardless of his personal history, the law applies equally. Theft is theft." Murmurs spread through the gallery. Harlow rose slowly, resting one hand on the table. "Your Honor, before this court passes judgment on Mr. Grady, I request permission to call a witness whose testimony speaks not only to the character of the accused, but also to the grave injustice that has been done to him." Judge Carmichael inclined his head. "Proceed." The doors at the back opened, and Colonel James Mason entered in full uniform. His medals caught the light as he strode forward, his presence commanding immediate respect. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even those who had come out of curiosity sat straighter, sensing history had walked into the room. Mason took the stand, his voice firm. "I served with Staff Sergeant Walter Grady. I watched him risk his life again and again, not for glory, not for recognition, but for the men beside him. He is the reason I am standing here today. He is the reason 17 men walked away from a burning transport in Iraq when they should have been ashes. He is the man in the photograph the world once saw, almost unlaw, carrying a wounded child from rubble, her tiny arms around his neck. That is Walter Grady. That is your defendant." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing as the room absorbed the revelation. The prosecutor rose swiftly. "Colonel, no one disputes the defendant's service, but the matter before us is simple. He stole. Whatever his past, the law cannot bend for sentiment." Mason's gaze sharpened. "With respect, counselor, this isn't about sentiment. This is about the truth. In 2008, due to a clerical error, Walter Grady's pension and medical care were terminated. He was cut off without explanation. I have documents here, affidavits from 5 men who served under him, and a letter from General Richards himself confirming his valor and the error that cost him everything. Over $246,000 in benefits were never paid. He didn't squander his life. He was robbed of it by the very system he served." He held up a folder thick with papers. The bailiff carried it to the bench. Judge Carmichael flipped through quickly, his lips tightening as line after line confirmed the colonel's words. The gallery buzzed louder now, voices rising in disbelief. Some wiped tears, others shook their heads in anger. The prosecutor attempted to interject, but Mason's words cut through the noise like steel. "You ask why a man like Walter would end up homeless? Look not at him, but at the system that failed him. This theft you speak of, this loaf of bread, was survival in the face of neglect. If justice means anything in this room, it cannot ignore that. Harlow rose again, his tone calm but resolute. Your Honor, we move that the charge be dismissed with prejudice. To prosecute Mr. Grady is to add insult to injury, to punish a man for enduring what should never have been inflicted on him. Judge Carmichael sat motionless for a long moment, the papers spread before him, the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. He could feel every eye on him, waiting. He cleared his throat, his voice quiet but steady. This court recognizes that the defendant's actions were not born of malice or greed, but of desperation brought on by failures beyond his control. The evidence of his service, his sacrifice, and the injustice done to him is undeniable. Therefore, the motion is granted. The charges against Walter Edward Grady are hereby dismissed with prejudice. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the gallery erupted, reporters rushing out with phones in hand, spectators applauding, veterans in the crowd rising to their feet in salute. Walter sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, unsure if he had heard correctly. You are free to go, Mr. Grady, the judge said, his eyes meeting Walter's. In that gaze lay the unspoken truth, recognition, gratitude, and a bond forged decades earlier in fire. Walter lowered his head, his chest rising with a shudder. For years he had carried his burdens in silence. Now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight began to lift. As the bailiff removed the cuffs, the clink of metal hitting wood echoed louder than the gavel. The courtroom had turned, and so too had Walter's fate. But outside these walls, the storm had only just begun. The world was waiting to hear the story of the man who had once been invisible, now thrust into the center of national attention. And Walter, still dazed, had no idea how deeply his life was about to change. If you've been following this journey, take a moment to stay with me now, because what unfolds here is not only redemption, but also the proof that truth, once spoken, can ripple farther than we imagine. Keep listening, share your thoughts, and let's honor the weight of this story together. The noise in the courtroom had barely settled when Walter felt a hand touch his shoulder. He turned, startled, and found himself staring into a pair of familiar eyes. Rebecca, Margaret's niece, stood there, her face trembling with emotion. She had not seen him in years, not since the funeral when grief had swallowed him whole. She reached forward without hesitation, wrapping her arms around him. For a man who had been untouched for so long, the embrace struck like a flood. Walter's chest heaved, and though his lips barely moved, his whisper carried to her ear. I thought I'd lost everyone. Rebecca shook her head, her tears dampening his coat. You didn't lose me. You didn't lose us. You just disappeared, Uncle Walter. We've been waiting. That first touch, simple, human, voluntary, broke the silence Walter had carried like armor. For years, people passed him as though he were invisible, and now here, in the open light of a courtroom, he was being seen again. As they stepped outside, the crowd pressed forward. Reporters thrust microphones in his face, cameras flashed, voices shouted questions. Walter staggered, overwhelmed, until a figure forced his way through the chaos. It was Morelli, the grocer from the corner market, his apron still dusted with flour. He held the loaf of bread in his hands, the very one Walter had been arrested for. I didn't know, Morelli said, his voice thick with shame. If I'd known, I'd have given you 10 loaves. I'm sorry. He pushed the bread into Walter's hands, a gesture so simple yet so heavy with meaning. Walter's throat closed, words lost somewhere between forgiveness and disbelief. He only nodded, clutching the bread as though it were holy. By nightfall, the story had spread beyond Brooklyn. News stations across the country replayed footage of Colonel Mason's testimony, the dismissal of charges, and the photograph of Walter carrying the Afghan child. Donations poured in. Within days, the fund created in Walter's name surged past $200,000, strangers giving not out of pity, but out of outrage at how he had been treated. The Department of Veterans Affairs, stung by the public fury, announced an emergency review of terminated cases. Walter's name was placed at the center of it, his case a symbol of how deep the cracks in the system had run. For years he had lived unseen, but now his story forced the nation to look directly at him. and threw him at thousands of others who had slipped through the same cracks. In a quiet moment away from cameras, Judge Carmichael sat with Walter in his chambers. The air between them was heavy with the unspoken bond of men who had once shared a battlefield. Carmichael removed a photograph from his drawer, the same one he had studied before. The squad lined up in desert heat, dust streaking their faces. He slid it across the table. "You remember this?" the judge asked. Walter's hands trembled as he lifted the picture. His eyes lingered on each face, men long scattered to the winds of time. And then, softer than breath, he said, "I remember telling you that night, just keep breathing, kid. Your story isn't over." Carmichael's throat tightened, and because of you, it wasn't. "I owe you my life, Walter. Today was the first time I've ever had the chance to repay even a fraction of that debt." Walter set the photo down, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he allowed the faintest smile to touch his lips. "You don't want to admire them. None of you do. No man left behind. That wasn't just something we said. It was something we lived." Rebecca, seated beside him, reached for his hand. "But we left you, Uncle Walter. We didn't know how much you were hurting. We didn't know where you went." Walter shook his head gently. "You couldn't have known. I didn't want anyone to see me fall." His voice softened, almost breaking. "Margaret was my compass. When she was gone, I lost the map." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with understanding. For the first time, Walter no longer carried his burden alone. Days turned into weeks. The donations continued to rise. But what mattered more were the letters that poured in. Letters from veterans who had also been cut off. From widows who had buried husbands without benefits. From children who remembered their father's nightmares. Walter read each one slowly, his hand steadying as he realized his story was no longer just his own. The VA formally admitted their error, restoring his pension and back pay. Over $246,000 were awarded, a figure that seemed meaningless compared to the years he had endured. But for Walter, the restitution was less about the money than about acknowledgement. At last, the institution that had failed him admitted he had existed, that he had mattered. He remained wary of the cameras that followed, but when asked to speak, he chose his words carefully. "I didn't want fame," he said. "I just wanted to keep a promise. To my wife, to my brothers in uniform, to myself. I didn't beg when I was hungry because I was still holding on to dignity. Today, you've reminded me that dignity can survive even when everything else is taken." One evening as the city quieted, Walter stood at the edge of Prospect Park. The same park where he had once slept under benches now stretched before him in a new light. Children laughed in the distance, their voices floating on the breeze. Rebecca walked beside him, her hand steadying his arm. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the cold bite of isolation. The world had shifted. From the silence of forgotten alleys, his story had risen into the open air. And in that rising, it carried not just his name, but the names of countless others who deserved to be remembered. Walter's lips parted, and a whisper escaped, carried away by the wind. "Maggie, I'm still here." And for the first time, the words felt less like survival and more like a promise renewed. The weeks that followed moved with a rhythm Walter had long forgotten. For the first time in years, each sunrise did not carry dread but a quiet possibility. The paperwork that once buried him in silence now carried a different weight. His pension was restored, his back pay issued, and with it came something he had thought lost forever: validation. In the courthouse where his story had first unfolded, a small ceremony was held in his honor. He entered not in rags, but in a suit provided by the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. On his chest gleamed the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart, medals polished until they caught the light like fire. For those who had only known him as a shuffling figure in doorways, the transformation was almost unreal. Judge Carmichael stood beside him, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "Justice," he declared to the assembled crowd, "is not only about punishment, it is about recognition. Today, we correct a wrong. Today, we honor a man whose service and sacrifice should never have been forgotten." Walter accepted the framed certificate with hands that no longer trembled. He did not smile broadly. His was not the joy of spectacle. Instead, it was a quiet satisfaction, a restoration of the dignity he had guarded fiercely even in his darkest nights. The ceremony was brief, but its echoes spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Legislators in the Capitol invoked Walter's name as they pushed for reforms in the Veterans Benefits System. News outlets replayed his story nightly, pairing the iconic photograph of him carrying the Afghan child with the more recent image of him in chains, and then the newest, standing tall with his medals displayed once more. The contrast struck deep, reminding the public of the thin line between honor and neglect. For Walter, however, the real changes were more personal. 6 months after the dismissal of his case, he moved into Veterans Village, a housing complex designed for those who had served but fallen on hard times. His small apartment overlooked a courtyard where children played and neighbors greeted one another warmly. On his walls he placed photographs: Margaret in her wedding dress, her smile untouched by illness, his unit in Iraq, sand and sun etched into their faces, and now a new one, him standing beside Judge Carmichael, Rebecca at his side, their hands linked in unspoken solidarity. The bed he slept in each night was his own. No more benches, no more cardboard shelters, no more waking to the bark of security guards chasing him from doorways. For the first time in years, he slept deeply. The nightmares did not vanish, but when they came, he had a place to ground himself, a home where light could be switched on, where the darkness was not absolute. One afternoon, Walter sat on a bench in Prospect Park, the same place that had once been his refuge of last resort. But now he was not hiding. He sat upright, watching children race along the grass, their laughter rising into the open sky. He breathed in the air, unhurried, unafraid of being moved along. A young boy, curious, stopped before him and asked, "Were you really a soldier?" Walter looked into the boy's wide eyes and nodded. "Yes," he said softly, "and I learned that being a soldier doesn't end when the war does. It means standing strong even when no one is watching." The boy grinned and ran back to his friends, but Walter remained. His gaze lifted not to the pavement but to the horizon. His story began to take shape in other ways too. Local schools invited him to speak, not about glory but about resilience. He stood before classrooms of restless teenagers, telling them about loyalty, about loss, about how dignity matters even when the world denies it. His voice carried weight not because of its volume, but because of the truth threaded through every word. The students listened, some with tears, some with newfound resolve. In time, the city commissioned a small bronze plaque to be placed outside the courthouse. It read, "Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten." The relief etched into the metal showed Walter carrying the wounded medic, the flag of the nation faintly waving behind them. People paused to read it as they passed, some lowering their heads in respect, others wiping their eyes before continuing on with their day. Walter visited the plaque only once. Standing before it, he felt no pride in the likeness. Instead, he felt a solemn duty that his story was now bigger than himself. It belonged to every man and woman who had walked through fire only to be left in the cold. He touched the bronze lightly, then turned away, leaving it for the world to remember. But his days were not consumed by public honors. They were filled with smaller, quieter victories. Sunday dinners with Rebecca and her children, laughter filling the kitchen in ways he hadn't heard since Margaret was alive. Mornings spent walking through the city without fear of being pushed aside. Evenings where he sat at his desk, writing letters to those who had reached out to him. Each one answered with care. The shadows of his past did not vanish, but they softened. The loneliness that had once been his only companion was now replaced by connection, by the knowledge that his life, once invisible, had become indelible. He carried Margaret with him still, speaking her name when the nights grew too quiet. But now he spoke it not as a plea, but as a promise. "See me now, Maggie," he would whisper into the dark. "I'm still standing." And perhaps in the unseen spaces between this world and the next, he felt her answer. Walter Grady, once overlooked by the city he had served, had stepped back into the light. And though the years lost could never be returned, the dignity restored burned brighter than the shadows that had once consumed him. The morning air was crisp the day the city unveiled its newest program. The mayor stood on the steps of the municipal building, flanked by veterans, officials, and a crowd of citizens who had come to witness something rare, an act of collective remembrance. Behind the podium hung a banner with bold letters that read, "The Grady Initiative." Walter stood slightly to the side, not seeking attention, but unable to escape it. Dressed in a tailored suit with his medals pinned neatly to his chest, he looked nothing like the man who had once shuffled through alleys with hunger, gnawing at his bones. He stood upright, steady, his expression calm yet solemn. The mayor's voice rang out. The Grady Initiative will ensure that every homeless veteran in this city has access to legal aid, medical support, and housing. No man or woman who has served this nation should ever be abandoned. This program, inspired by the courage and endurance of Staff Sergeant Walter Edward Grady, will remind us of our duty to those who defended us. Applause swept through the crowd. Some clapped with enthusiasm. Others with quiet reverence. Veterans in uniform saluted, their hands trembling slightly as age caught up with them. Walter bowed his head, humbled by the weight of the moment. At the heart of the event, a 10-year-old girl stepped forward, clutching a folded paper. Her name was Anna, and she had won a citywide essay contest about veterans. She adjusted her glasses nervously before beginning. My grandfather was a soldier, she read, her voice small but clear. He told me that heroes don't always wear uniforms forever. Sometimes they wear memories instead. Mr. Grady's story taught me that even heroes can be forgotten. But it also taught me that we can choose to remember. Remembering is another way of saving someone. Tears welled in the eyes of many who listened. Walter's own chest tightened. That a child could see so clearly what so many adults had overlooked gave him hope that the next generation might carry forward a different kind of loyalty. After the ceremony, Walter joined Judge Carmichael and Colonel Mason at a nearby community center where a small reception was held. Families gathered around him, some thanking him quietly, others asking for photos. Children clutched miniature flags, waving them with unfiltered joy. Walter moved through them gently, speaking softly, listening more than he spoke. Later that evening, he sat at Rebecca's dinner table. Her children passed him plates, laughing over inside jokes he didn't yet understand but would, with time. He chewed slowly, savoring the warmth of food shared in a home that welcomed him. When Rebecca asked if he was angry about the years he had lost, Walter set his fork down and considered. I don't need pity, he said finally, and I don't need anger. What I hope is that what happened to me will not happen to another. That's enough. I don't want revenge. I want remembrance. I want those who come after me to know that those who came before mattered. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed his hand, her eyes shimmering with pride. Autumn came, and with it, Veterans Day. At Fort Hamilton, a large crowd gathered for the annual commemoration. For the first time in decades, Walter stood among the honored. Dressed in full uniform, clean, pressed, complete with medals, he looked every bit the soldier he had always been. The years of exile could not erase what the fabric and insignia represented. When his name was called, Walter stepped to the podium. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the rows of men and women who had served, the families clutching photographs of loved ones, the school children waving flags. He took a breath, his voice carrying steady across the assembled. I once protected this country, he began, and for a long time, I believed my country had forgotten me. But I was wrong, because today I see all of you here. I see the children who will carry our stories forward. I see the families who kept the faith, and I see a nation that has chosen to remember. Kindness is never too late. Justice is never too late. And though my path was hard, I stand here to tell you, it was not in vain. The audience rose, not in applause but in silent salute. The sound of hundreds of hands lifting in unison filled the air with reverence. Walter's gaze lifted as well, no longer fixed on the ground, but drawn upward to the horizon. After the ceremony, a reporter asked what he hoped people would remember most about his story. Walter thought for a long moment before answering. Don't remember the bread, don't remember the courtroom. Remember the men I carried, remember the woman I loved. Remember that no man left behind means all of us. On the battlefield, in the streets, in the halls of justice, that's what I want remembered. In the months that followed, the Grady Initiative expanded beyond the city, adopted by other states. His story, once confined to shadows, became a blueprint for compassion and reform. Schools taught about him not as a figure of tragedy, but as a testament to resilience. His photograph, no longer just a soldier carrying a child, but also the man in court, the man redeemed, hung in civic halls across the country. At home, Walter found comfort in simple rituals, tending a small garden outside his apartment, reading books Margaret once loved, writing letters to fellow veterans who reached out in search of hope. Each letter ended the same: "You are not forgotten. Not now, not ever." Years later, when his steps grew slower and his hair fully white, Walter would walk once more to Prospect Park. He sat on the same bench where he had once slept in despair, now a place of reflection. Children still played there, their laughter a melody against the city's hum. He smiled faintly, feeling the weight of time but also its mercy. He thought of Margaret, of the men he had served beside, of Carmichael, Mason, Rebecca, Anna, and the countless strangers whose kindness had lifted him back into the light. His life had been fractured, yes, but it had also been mended. And as he watched the sunset bleed across the sky, Walter whispered the words that had sustained him through both war and peace: "No man left behind." This time he knew he truly believed them. Walter Grady's journey reminds us of something we too often forget: that behind every weary face may lie a story of sacrifice we cannot see. His life teaches us that dignity can be buried but not destroyed, that justice may come late but still arrive with force, and that kindness has the power to restore what neglect once took away. Let this story be more than memory. Let it be a call to see the invisible, to honor the forgotten, and to carry forward the promise that no one who serves should ever stand alone. If this story moved you, stay with us. Continue following, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep telling the stories that matter. Don't forget to like this video and be part of the community that chooses to remember.